Good afternoon, everybody. Charles McKenzie here, Occupational Health and Safety Manager of the Manufacturing Safety Alliance of BC. Today we are going over the Safety in Specific Programs Part 2. We did a lot of these in Part 1. We're going to quickly review some of the stuff that we went over, and I was able to fit in some time today about talking about due diligence. It's very important. It's a term that's used quite often, thrown around out there, and not a lot of people know exactly what it means. I want to explore that today. So moving forward, our industry specific control programs review. Last session, we broke down it into the 15 subcategories. We'll talk about those in a minute. And we went over the legislation aspects. Each one of the industry-specific programs does have a designated spot in the occupational health and safety regulations to reference for what is required and for compliance. So just to summarize here, we talked about contract safety management, we talked about mobile equipment, confined space entry, radiation, lockout de-energization, hot work, fall protection, industry-specific, processes-specific monitoring, WSBC, hearing conservation, MSI, multiple skeletal injury prevention, that's ergonomics, industrial storage, racking systems, machine safeguarding, fixed overhead cranes and hoists, and working alone or in isolation. So some of these may not apply to you, then we can disregard them. If they do apply to your company, then we need to look and reference that in the OHS regulation. Some of the other industry control programs that are not in our OC audit, but most companies do have, is that they have something in the way of an injury management return to work plan. And the categories there are the resources, education and training, early intervention, communication. A lot of places nowadays, and this is one of the ones that WorkSafe is starting to look at, is violence in the workplace and bullying and harassment. Another one that is not in our audit currently right now, but down the road will, I believe, become one of the subcategories is a respiratory program. So if you have to wear a half-face respirator or a full respirator, and then of course anytime we have a respirator, we need to have a developed exposure plan. The last one is combustible dust. There may be other industry control programs that may apply specifically to you, but generally these are the majority of them. So we went over in detail each one of these last webinar. Just to review the structure of a control program, this is basically generic for every one of the subcategories. This is what we need to do. We need to identify and list the equipment, machineries, and/or tasks. We need to list the necessary steps in sequential order. We need to identify the hazards. We need to use the risk assessment and the risk matrix, and remember that's the likelihood over consequence. We need to use the hierarchy of control. That is, to recap, that is elimination, substitution, engineering control, administration, and PPE. We need to develop safe operating procedures, SOPs. We sometimes use safe work procedures, which are the SWPs. We need to deliver training, supervision. We need to have supervision, and we need to have competency tests. Regular inspections and maintenance, whether that is our health and safety representative, you need to have monthly inspections of your facility, but also part of having a maintenance program helps with your tools and equipment and falls under the OHS aspects. And then we have to have program evaluation and annual review, where we have to review of what we're doing. Is it effective? Can we improve on it? Does it need to be improved on it? Because there's three things that you can do. You can do nothing, do more, or do less. So when we do a review, it usually falls under one of those things. If your system and documentation is where it should be, then you don't have to do anything. If you're lacking and you find a gap, then you need to do more. Or maybe you're overshooting and you're exceeding what it needs to, and maybe it's taking up too much time, and we can cut it back a bit, and we can use the resources or time and allocate that differently. Again, to review the program evaluation, this is ultimately the responsible of the employer. We need to set yearly goals and objectives, and and they are to have health and safety associated with that, not just having a business plan on profits or quantities or quality. We need to add an aspect of health and safety to the company's goals and objectives for the year. We need to keep current and active anything in occupational health and safety. Our manual, our programs, our occupational health and safety management system is alive. It's documented, it's current, it's ongoing. We use the acronym Plan, Do, Check, Act. So it's always evolving and we're trying to improve. We talked a bit about leading and lagging indicators, the difference between the two and how to use those. We talked about the Employer Planning Toolkit. That's a free resource from WorkSafe BC. All you need is I believe it's your payroll number and your employee number, and you can have access to your report card for your company. It's quite a useful tool. And then again, we have to have the formal review process, involve workers or a safety representative. So today, our course objectives is to understand the term due diligence, and hopefully we'll have enough time there that I have a case study that I would like to review. It happened in the courts just 2 years ago, and it was the defense of a company that used due diligence. So the course topics today, lesson 1, we'll talk about due diligence. Lesson 2, the basic elements of due diligence. Lesson 3, communication. Lesson 4, documentation. Lesson 5, we're going to review a case study. I know these are different than the documentation slides that you have of the previous time that this webinar was run. This presentation and audio and PowerPoint will be made available shortly on our resources page for you guys to follow. So for lesson 1, due diligence. What is the standard of due diligence? Well, what does that mean? We're going to look at what is the defense of due diligence. What is the test of due diligence? And when we look at an occupational health and safety management system, what does that have to do with due diligence? So for the first one, what is the standard of due diligence? Due diligence is defined as taking all reasonable care to prevent the occurrence of an incident or an event. You're doing what any other reasonable person / company would do. The second one here is due diligence in a safety management can be described as a system approach that provides information, instruction, training, supervision, information, verification of knowledge, and correction of physical and human hazards. So basically, you're doing what any other reasonable company would do, and you're not putting your workers at harm. What is the defense of due diligence? All reasonable precautions to comply were taken in the circumstances. This will become a bit more clear in the case study that we'll look at, because there's some details in there. If this doesn't make sense now, it will make sense later. So again, we're doing what any other normal company would do in good faith in whatever circumstances arise there. What is the test of due diligence? Well, we need to look at the documentation of an OHS program, because having an OHS program is proving your due diligence. The level of due diligence will be determined by the complexity, let's say, of the OHS program. But every OHS program needs to include a written OHS program, that you have something in writing. And it's not just the fact that you have something in writing or that it's a manual that's put on the shelf, but also that it's been implemented. There's two things in that statement there. One, having a written OHS program. The other one is implementing what it says on the floor. There's nothing worse than having something happen, WorkSafe comes on site, you have a program, you get credit for that, but then you're not in practice because you're not doing what your own program has outlined you to do. I've seen that happen a few times. The next step here is an employer who takes the steps to control or eliminate specific hazards. One of the best things WorkSafe wants to see is one that we've identified a hazard and we're putting some control measures in place. One of the best ways to exercise this statement is to do hazard assessments and write our standard operating procedures where we recognize what the potential hazards are, whether they're physical, chemical, biological, or psychological. We put engineering controls in place, whether it's using the hierarchy of control. Remember, that's eliminate, substitute, engineering, administration, and PPE. This is all proving our due diligence. Having written SOPs that are understood and followed by workers. This is where I like to recommend that whenever we develop a SWB or an SOP, that we have a competency test, because it can be open book. I recommend that it is open book, but it's another level showing that people have some understanding of what is expected of whatever actions that they need to do. It's a lot easier to show due diligence if something was to happen and an employee was hurt, and we could say as the employer that we've done all these crew talks, we've had meetings, we've done training, but if it's not documented, it's not signed off on, then you really can't prove that. Having a competency test that the worker fills out shows that they're competent and they're not just bobbing their head saying, yeah, I get it, is another level of due diligence. Workers are provided with adequate instruction, training, supervision, and discipline to work safely. I think that one's kind of self-explanatory. I've had in my days, way back when, minimal instruction. If you can remember back to the first day that it was your first job, try and think about how much instruction you got that day. Probably wasn't much. So that's somewhat, we need to be in that mindset that when we're training new people or cross-training them or moving them to a different department or a different tool or task, we need to make sure that they fully understand what they need to do, how they need to do it, and what the potential hazards are. An occupational health and safety management system, you've heard me say that before. The difference between an OH&S program and an OH&S management system is basically the management system is how it's implemented and it becomes a system. Whereas anybody can have an OH&S program that it's all typed up, written nicely in a binder and put on a shelf and dust collects. It's your management system that is your everyday, that takes what is written in your manual and implements that, and it's reflected out onto the floor. Here we have a statement that safety is just like any other business system, like production, quality, inventory control, accounting, or payroll. One must manage safety like a business system that needs to be designed, developed, implemented, and evaluated to provide effectiveness and value. That design, develop, implement, and evaluate is the same as plan, do, check, act. That is our quick summary here of due diligence. All right, for lesson 2, the basic elements of due diligence, we're going to look at information, instruction, training, and supervision. So the basic elements of due diligence is information and instruction. What's this mean? It is the part of the system that ensures that the workers receive the appropriate level of education they need to do their work safely. So do they know what they need to do? Do they know their deliverables? Do they know the method that they need to do it? Do they know how to operate the tools? Education can routinely take place in a classroom setting, crew talks, one-on-one safety reviews, or through written and verbal instructions. The next basic element of due diligence is training. Training typically takes place on the job assigned. Training system includes training standards, selection of trainers, supervision during training, verification of training, and demonstrated competencies when training is completed. So back in the day when I was a journeyman and I had apprentices underneath me, one of the best things that I did was I would tell someone what I would want and how to do it. I would show them how to do it. I would let them do it with the verbal of them verbally telling me what they would do, and then I would let them do it on their own. There was no way that I was letting them go around and play with 240 or 480 by themselves unless they were able to verbally tell me how it was done. The next section here, basic elements of due diligence. Supervision. This part of the system ensures that verification and training, we got to make sure that our supervisors are involved in this, that the identification and the corrective of hazards. Our workers have a responsibility, but so do our supervisors and management for that, but our supervisors are generally the eyes on the floor. We need to have and make sure that there's direct observation of workers. This one often goes by the wayside when there's no observation notes or supervisory notes and no record of any kind of observation of workers. Supervisors need to make sure that they're correcting unsafe or unwanted behaviors, because if they ignore it, they're condoning it, and that only builds to a negative safety culture. Part of the system also ensures that there's direction and instruction to the workers. There's a response to workers' questions and concerns. With supervisors out on the floor, there should be an atmosphere where individuals can ask questions and raise their concerns. Another way is doing crew talks. I know a lot of companies like to blend this in with a production talk or expectations, what are required that week. They blend it in with some health and safety, the last 5 minutes, 10 minutes of it, and then it gives opportunity for anybody to ask questions if need be. And again, documentation. If we don't document anything that we say or do, there's no way that we can prove that it's happened. A lot needs to be documented. In real estate, the most famous 3 words are location, location, location. In health and safety, it's document, document, document. If it's not documented, you can't prove that it's happened. Supervision continued. As a supervisor, they must have clear and understanding of the responsibilities within the management system. So do you guys hopefully have it outlined what the roles and responsibilities are for the supervisor, what the expectations are, and how you're going to measure them? There's an often mistaken belief that due diligence is merely a CYA. It is correct. It is true. We don't want to just look at covering your own, because what ends up happening is you miss out on what the legal requirements are. Lesson 3, communication. We're going to talk about learning styles, learning processes, and communication tools. For communication, we need to make sure that all levels have good communication skills, whether this is management, supervisors, your OHS representative. Having good communication skills is essential. That way we get the message across, the expectations, everybody knows what the deliverables are, and there's no ambiguity. We need to be able to pass on information. A lot of times people aren't given the right amount of information or not at the right time. We need to provide training and feedback, communicating that when training should happen, having that set up, and more importantly on this note is the feedback. Does the individual actually know what they're doing, or did they luck out, they did it that way the first time? Are they competent enough that you can walk away and turn your back and you feel confident that they have a great understanding of what they're doing, and they won't put themselves in a situation where they could potentially hurt themselves? Gaining understanding. The understanding comes from training and education. Letting people know information is key. Essentially here we got to make sure that we correct mistakes or unsafe behaviors, because especially if you have new workers, the new workers will look at what other people are doing, whether it's the right way or the wrong way. If we don't correct those behaviors, it often gets seen as that is the norm or the way to do things, whether that is right or wrong. The way I like to look at it, when you have someone that is veteran and is training a new employee, they get all their good traits, but they also get all their bad habits as well. So we need to look at that and just make sure that we're observing and correcting any unsafe behaviors. Communication, there's many ways of doing that. As we all know, it can be written, verbal, visual, through body language, by demonstrating, or simply leading by example. And the last one, leading by example, that is key for management, supervisors, owners, presidents. There's nothing worse that will set, or nothing greater that will set an OHS management system backwards or stop progress, is when senior management or lead people, like lead people as in supervisors, lead hands, management, when they don't follow the policies themselves or are not leading by example. That's a 10-step backwards on that one. So when we look at this next chart here, we've broken it down to learning styles, learning processes, and communication. For the visual learner, you need to see it to believe it. So the graphics, videos, notes, illustrations, and charts. For the auditory learner, they need to hear it to believe it. verbal instruction, lectures, discussions. And the tactual learner needs to touch it to remember it. So role plays, hands-on, models, computers. These are the three basic learning styles, the different learning processes for each one of these. Often, if we go to WorkSafe BC website under the different elements and the parts, they're called parts in the OHS regulations. WorkSafe BC, one of their departments, they're broken into 3 departments, but one of their departments is resources and prevention. It's actually prevention, but they have a list of resources that are either PDF, Word, templates, or even videos. So it will help with no matter what learning style your employees are. There's a lot that are out there that can help, because not just one learning style is better than another. Just people learn differently, and if we can blend them or do multiples at the same time, that would be the best way. So in lesson 4 here, we're going to look at employer documentation, effective OH&S program, supervisors, workers, and disciplinary procedures. The employer documentation retention. So what does the employer need to keep records of? You need to keep records of workers' orientations. WorkSafe BC has a new/young worker orientation checklist. This is the basis that you should set your orientation off of for 2 reasons. One, it's from the regulator themselves, and if we should use any of their templates, at least the minimum requirements of those templates. We can add more to it, but you'll never get in trouble for using one of their forms. We need to keep records of inspection reports and corrective action. A lot of times I see companies that may or may not do an inspection report, and we'll talk about that in the upcoming webinar. But inspection reports, monthly, there's a general workplace inspection that needs to be done. We need to have it documented, and we need to document what the corrective actions are. Again, WorkSafe wants to see that you're recognizing and you've identified a potential hazard or an issue, and you're doing something about it. Doesn't have to be the best way, the ideal way the first time, but you need to put something in place as a preventative measure, and then you can reevaluate it later, whether it's just a temporary measure or you want to improve upon it. As I said before, documentation. We need records of any kind of meetings, crew talks, toolbox talks. This sounds very tedious and it's time consuming, but it somewhat is. If you develop a process, what I've got a lot of companies doing is they have their crew talks or meetings already pre-outlined, so they're just reading off of a sheet like as a guide, and they have an attendance sheet that they can fill out quickly on that. It's one of the best ways to prove any kind of meeting or crew talks, because it could be training, it could be an awareness, it could be anything. This is one of the best ways, because we can prove that we had that meeting or had that talk with that individual. And this will go back to pretend that there's a claim that comes out of this. If we can prove that that employee was instructed, they had standard operating procedures or safe work procedures, we can prove that we had crew talks, can prove that you guys did give them the knowledge, the education, and the training. What will happen there is that individual, depending on their injury, will still get compensated, but that compensated cost of the time loss claim will not be awarded directly to your company. Especially with smaller companies, that can be quite a big hit to take if a time loss claim goes against your company, depending on the severity and the duration of the recovery time. We also need to show progressive discipline. If we've written someone up, or we start off first with a verbal warning, if we have a written warning, maybe it comes down to a suspension or discipline or a termination. And in that clause, in the progressive discipline, there's always the clause that you can go 1 to 4, depending on the severity of the actions. Just recently, in one of the companies that I deal with directly, had someone terminated because they took a torch to someone's back, just thought it would be funny to heat them up. Well, it caught their coveralls on fire. The gentleman ended up with 3rd-degree burns. That's not safe, nor cool, nor funny for that matter, because the individual was ended up having quite a bit of pain and a legitimate injury here. So that was an easy one where the employer just terminated the person right then and there. We need to make sure that our subcontractors have pre-qualifications. So ideally, we're meant to look at and make sure that they have a program. At a minimum, I would say make sure that they're registered with WorkSafe BC and that they have insurance, because if not, you're the prime. You will be considered the prime, and if something goes wrong, it comes back on you and your company under your number. We also need to make sure that we're keeping records of first aid records, medical certificates. Can you prove that your first aid attendant / attendants are certified? Are they at the right level? Every year we're meant to do hearing testing. So a lot of third companies automatically send that automatically to WorkSafe for you. We need to make sure they'll also give you a copy, but we need to make sure that we have a record retention on that one. For the hearing test, that's for as long as they're employed. We need to make sure that we do sampling and monitoring of exposures to harmful substances if that is a situation at your facility. We need to look at whether there's an OH&S regulated budget or purchase orders. Maybe we don't have a budget, proper budget, or we do things as come by, but to be able to prove that you make PPE available to your employees. Whether they wear it or not, that's an enforcement issue. But as an employer, you know, do they have the tools or equipment or personal protective equipment to do their job? Again, further on, document retention here, we need to make sure that the workers and supervisors receive training. A lot of times this is a common mistake where someone gets moved up to supervisor or manager because they have the most seniority. Sometimes that's not the best idea, because you know what, they may be a great worker, they've been there the longest, but when you move up to a supervisory role or a management role, some people aren't cut out to do it. You run yourself into some issues. We also need to make sure that we have incident investigations recorded, and we'll learn this again when we go to that section in the webinar, but incident investigations need to be done within 48 hours of the incident, and we need to put preliminary corrective actions in place and then have full correction actions, and we'll discuss that later. Supervisory notes and logs. This is another one where it's nice to have a record of, maybe you do a walk around and your supervisor walks around and says everybody was wearing their PPE at the time of a walk around. We've got to make sure that we also highlight the positives, so it's not just negative finding. We don't want to just highlight what's wrong. We also want to give kudos or write notes that, you know, we can reference later to give kudos towards someone that was doing something. Maybe for the entire week, every time we did, the supervisor or management did a walkabout onto the floor, that the forklift operator was wearing his seatbelt or using the horn correctly, or people had the right PPE on, whatever that is. We need to make sure that the supervisors have notes, because if something happens, it's one of the things that WorkSafe's going to ask for. We need to make sure that there's Joint Health and Safety Committee minutes. So I've provided a template before with a safety representative. And when you're small and under 19, you only need one member. You don't need an entire committee. We need to make sure that there's minutes there. With those minutes on the template I provided, it also gives you some stats, frequencies by department, and the different types of injuries, which will really help with tracking and trending if for your committee, for your representative, and for management as well. We need to make sure that we have equipment logs and maintenance records. There's an easy form that you can download and just Google BC retention forms, and it'll give you a list of everything that you need to keep records of. For the most part, any kind of equipment and maintenance records you need to keep for the entirety of the existence of that tool or equipment while on site. We need checklists for workers to follow, whether this is a written checklist, a guidance checklist, or it could be a standard operating procedure or a safe work procedure. We also need to make sure that we have an emergency response plan in place, what to do in the case of. Each individual company will have its own potential risks and hazards here. Everybody will know if something was to go wrong, what would it be? We focus around that, develop some emergency response plans, whether for the most part, for almost all of them, it's evacuate the building, meet up at a spot, take an attendance, have set roles for the first aid attenders. But the other big one here is drills. By regulation, every company is meant to do a drill yearly. A lot of times people get very busy, especially during the summer months, the nice months, and they get down near the end of the year and it starts raining and snow and they don't want to do an evacuation. And then they pass on it and it becomes Christmas, New Year's, and then for whatever reason, WorkSafe shows up, they look into this, and then a drill was never done. So you need to try and not try, but by regulation, you're meant to have a drill, do an evacuation drill yearly. The stats, looking at the frequency and severity of your injuries. This goes back to the joint health and safety minutes. You can use the same form. What we're looking to do is track and trend injuries. What department, what type of an injury it is, how long they were, and then what that does is it helps us focus where we need to put some attention to. It's not fault finding it the way it is. This is where our potential injuries are, so how can we help mitigate those risks? Evidence of an effective OHS program must have an OHS policy. This policy must also be public, so it's not just in a binder somewhere. A lot of companies like to put their policy framed within the walkway or the front doors of the building. The policy should also be on your health and safety board, a written copy, signed and dated by the most senior position in the company and dated within the current year. We also need to look at having a health and safety representative. Being small business, less than 19, you don't need a committee, but you at a minimum need a safety representative. On the management side of things, we need to make sure that OHS is a topic. It's not just production or quality insurance, financing, whatever. We need to make sure that OHS issues are discussed there. We need to make sure that we're, again, with the contractors, because you guys are small companies, I reckon that you guys are using a lot of contractors. So we got to make sure that they know what the regulations are, that they're in compliance with the regulations. And again, because they're on your site, you are considered the prime contractor. So if something happens, you're on the hook for it. Documentation control, that's with your whole management system, everything we've talked about here. For a smaller company, I think you can get by with Excel or Word. When you start getting into larger numbers with companies, there's so much documentation that there's a lot of software systems out there that can really assist with that. Further, we need to look at statistics and trends, as I've mentioned. We need to make sure that we're doing hazard identification, that we've got the training, that we know what to look for, and we're constantly looking for it. It's not just the role of the supervisor or management to identify hazards. It's also, there's onus on the employee to identify potential hazards. We need to have the appropriate control measures in place. Again, that's the hierarchy of control. We have elimination, substitution, engineering, administration, and PPE. We need to make sure that you have a preventative maintenance program in place. Whatever the schedule of that is, we need to maintain. Management needs to respect the recommendations of your OHS representative. There is a formal form for the representative or joint health and safety committee members to make recommendations up to senior management. Usually this is there's usually a larger cost associated with this recommendation because you're usually getting into capital expenditure, and it's not something that can be decided just right then and there. Management goes to senior management or stakeholders and gets approval that way. You need to make sure that there's an OHS program review. Again, we want to do our program review yearly, and it's nice once we have it set up to look at 1 or 2 elements a month. That way we don't end up at the end of the year having to review the entire program. Documentation for supervisors. We need to make sure that they receive training. I'm going to provide a link on the next slide, I believe. I recommend that all supervisors or managers take this training. It's free. It's from the WSBC website, and they will issue a certificate on successful completion. It's one of the best ways to provide due diligence to your supervisors as an employer, showing that you have received training. Again, we need to look at making sure that the supervisors are doing crew talks or toolbox talks. Inspections, we need to make sure that the supervisors are involved in the inspections, the walkabouts, whether that's a formal or an informal. We need to make sure that the supervisors are involved in incident investigations. We need to make sure that supervisors are involved in the orientation. We need to make sure that they're involved in the on-the-job training, that they're overseeing, that it's not just the general orientation. Read this. We go back into the tactile learner. Tell them what you wanted them to do. Show them what you want them to do. Let them do it. And as they're doing it, let them explain it to you. And if they can do that, that shows that they understand what the expectations are. We need to make sure that we're evaluating training. Is there enough training? Is there not enough training? What areas do we need to have the training in? We need to monitor the work conditions. Are things changing? Are there new processes, new equipment? Maybe we're switching individuals from different departments that used to do something and now they're doing something else. We need to correct employees, let's say, bad behaviors. We need to make sure that they're not putting themselves at risk. We also need to record progressive discipline. If it is required, then we need to record that. OHS overall performance evaluation. At the end of the year, our staff, supervisor, workers, is there an overall evaluation? And if so, is their OHS performance, attitude, compliance, is that part of that evaluation? And if not, why not? Why isn't it? This is the link here, and I'll give you a second to write this down. This automatically puts you to the WorkSafe BC site. It's called supervisingforsafety.com, supervisingforsafety.com. If I remember correctly, it's about 8 hours, but you can do the different modules one at a time. So you don't have to sit for a full 8 hours and do it all in one go. You can do, you know, some of them are I wouldn't say 5 minutes, let's say 20 minutes, maybe a half hour, another maybe a full hour. It's an excellent review of hazard ID and control, but it also, at the end of the day, counts as certification for training, and you can prove that you as a company or you as a supervisor have received supervisory training. Documentation for workers. They need to receive an orientation. We talked about that. They need specific job instructions, whether that's a safe work procedure or an SOP. Do they have health and safety training? Do they know general site-specific safety rules, hazards, potential hazards? Are there SOPs, safe work procedures? Do they have the skills and knowledge to do what they're doing? If not, how do we give them to them? How do we train them? If they don't have them and you don't foresee them doing it, then maybe we need to switch what they're doing. Or maybe they're just not the right people to do what is required. They have a responsibility themselves to report hazards and injuries. They have the right to participate in inspections and the right to participate in incident investigation. For disciplinary procedures, this applies to workers, supervisors, management. It's not just workers that end up with disciplinary procedures. I've seen supervisors and I've seen managers all get written up, or I've even seen them terminated in some facilities. So the disciplinary procedure here applies to all levels. And then, are there written disciplinary procedures? Is this part of your orientation booklet? Do people know what the progressive disciplines are? Do they know that there's 4 steps that end with the clause that you can go 1 to 5? Is it written in a book, and then are they aware of it? Most times this is put in an orientation, there's a discussion, and then the employee signs off that they understand, that they know that this is a rule, let's call it that, at the facility. And then, is disciplinary procedures being used effectively? Like, are we consistent? There's nothing worse, again, that will hurt a system is if we're inconsistent. We can't have workers being written up for something and then the supervisor does the same thing and then the supervisor isn't written up. Or as I said earlier, management. If we're trying to enforce PPE out on the floor and management wants to go for a walkabout and they're not wearing the appropriate PPE, there's nothing that sets any kind of progress further backwards than not having management or supervisors be in the lead roles. Monitored by the safety representative, and then is it recorded somewhere? Again, these are not public records when an individual gets written up. Usually the supervisor knows, management / HR if you have that, or most times management is HR, but they're not common record. This is the case here. We're going to open up a case here. I know we're getting close to time here, but I'd like to go through it. It's just going to open up here. Give it a second. And I'm going to let you guys read it. I'm going to just bring it up here, and then we'll discuss it in a bit here. So we're reading the left side here. This happened in July 14, 2015. All right, so I'm just going to read the conclusion again and then read the due diligence defense. So in conclusion, in this case, the case confirms that in situations where a worker proceeds to undertake work which he or she is not clearly not authorized or directed to conduct, the defense of due diligence will be available. Given the due diligence is available to the employer in all provinces, this should assist employees right across the country. So what happened here is an individual did something that they don't normally do. They weren't told to do that, and the individual went and did it anyways. So we'll just read here again the due diligence defense up the top here. In assessing whether the defense of due diligence was made out, the court decided it was necessary to inquire to one of two things: whether what transpired was reasonable foreseeable, and whether ABS safety training and procedures. So looking at the individual company's training procedures. In review of the facts, the court concluded that there was no procedure for rotating the spindle, nor had there ever been a need to do so until the change in order by the buyer. The court also concluded that the worker who claimed that he was told to rotate the spindle was not credible. The supervisor gave evidence because the spindle was a very heavy piece of equipment. There was no expectation that a junior worker would be responsible for rotating it. Instead, the senior employee on the job, the supervisor, would have had that responsibility. In terms of the due diligence defense, the court said that it was insufficient for the employer to merely point to a worker's negligence, carelessness, or even reckless conduct to successfully reply upon the due diligence in court. The court framed the issue as one of the foreseeables and considered whether a reasonable employer would have foreseen the worker attempting to rotate the spindle. The court concluded that a reasonable employer would not have foreseen the worker and would undertake to rotate the spindle of his own and in the manner that he did. So again, this is a court case, and I know it's going to set precedents because what happens in one province, the other provinces are looking at it. This is a real court case. If we go back up to the top, I can send this link to you guys again if you would like to read it again, but it was in here. It happened in Ontario, and it's R versus the ABS Machining Inc. Happened in Mississauga. So that's just an example of, we talk about due diligence, you know, and people always ask, well, has there ever been a court case? Well, here is a court case that happened. It was 2 years ago. There may be something more recent now. I haven't done a search. This is the example that I like to use because it's relevant. It's still within just over 2 years old here. So this is an example of our where due diligence has held up in court because the company didn't, it was unforeseeable. If we know things are foreseeable, we need to do something. We can't, as a company, as employers, supervisors, put everybody in a bubble wrap and that they're going to do something that's unforeseeable, or we can't have the world walking around thinking that the sky's falling. If it's foreseeable, we need to do something. If it's unforeseeable, well then it's just that, it's unforeseeable. So that is that case. I will send the link if you guys would like. You can just email me. So in summary 4, we looked at the case study. I know we're kind of rushed here because once again I'm over my 1-hour time. That seems to be the norm for me in this webinar, but I think that's okay because you guys are still following along. Today we looked at due diligence. We looked at the basic elements of due diligence, communication, documentation, and reviewed a case study. So I hope today I gave you some new insight, information, and knowledge on due diligence. And as I said, this presentation will be made available on our resource page. I'm going to call that for today. Thank you for listening to me. I hope you got something out of this today. Today we did the industry-specific programs part 2. Spent the majority of time talking about due diligence. Thank you very much, and we'll see you in 3 weeks.